I thought I was just his friend, until she whispered my name, and nothing was the same. I first noticed her on a lazy Saturday afternoon, when my friend had dragged me along to his house for one of those casual, almost boring get-togethers. I had always known her by reputation, my friend's mom, the woman everyone admired quietly but never spoke too loudly about. But seeing her in person was different. She moved with a kind of effortless grace that made it hard to look away, the way she carried herself and laughed with a lightness that felt entirely her own. She wore a soft sweater, the kind that looked like it had been perfectly lived in, and her hair fell just past her shoulders, catching the afternoon light and subtle shades of honey. I felt an inexplicable pull, a quiet curiosity I couldn't name. Maybe it was the way she tilted her head when she listened, giving her full attention to whoever was speaking. Or maybe it was something in her eyes, bright, warm, and just a little guarded, like she was offering a piece of herself only to those who noticed. I found myself lingering at the edges of conversation, not because I wanted to eavesdrop, but because her presence made the room feel smaller in a comforting way, almost like a soft pressure drawing me closer without a word. When I brushed past her in the kitchen, our fingers touched for a brief moment, accidental but electric. My chest tightened slightly at the contact, and for the first time that afternoon, I felt fully aware of her. She didn't pull away either, letting her hand hover near mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and in that small, fleeting touch, something unspoken passed between us. She laughed at something my friend said, and the sound reached me even across the room. It wasn't loud or flashy, it was quiet, layered with warmth and something softer, like an invitation to notice the world from her perspective. I caught her glance as she looked in my direction. It lasted for barely a second, yet it made my heart stumble. I smiled nervously, unsure whether I was overthinking, but there was a subtle acknowledgement there, something that whispered of awareness, curiosity, maybe even shared recognition of a fleeting connection. Throughout the afternoon, I became attuned to the small details, the slight tilt of her wrist as she poured tea, the faint scent of vanilla mixed with something earthy and familiar, the way her lips curved just a little when she smiled at me across the room. Every gesture felt deliberate yet natural, as if she carried a quiet rhythm in her presence that drew me in without needing to say a word. By the time the gathering began to wind down, I realized I had been watching her almost constantly, not out of rudeness but out of a strange, irresistible fascination. I didn't understand why I felt this pull, why a simple touch or glance left me unsettled in the best possible way. Something had shifted between us, subtle but undeniable, a quiet connection that hinted at a story neither of us had yet dared to name. And as I left that afternoon, walking out into the crisp evening air, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever feel quite ordinary again. The night had fallen, soft and quiet, leaving the house wrapped in the gentle hum of evening. Most of the guests had left, my friend had disappeared into a room with his video games, and for a fleeting moment, I realized I was alone with her. Just her. She leaned against the kitchen counter, a warm mug of tea cradled in her hands, and looked at me with that same subtle curiosity I had noticed earlier. The way her eyes met mine was not commanding or forward, but steady, inviting conversation without saying a word. I felt my chest tighten slightly, aware of how small the space between us had suddenly become. "I didn't expect anyone to stay behind," she said softly, voice low, smooth, yet carrying a trace of amusement. She tilted her head, giving me that slight, knowing smile that made my stomach flutter. I guess I didn't feel like leaving yet," I admitted, surprised at how honestly the words came. I didn't know if it was nervousness or something else that made my voice feel unsteady. She stepped closer, the air between us carrying warmth, her perfume, light, floral, comforting, hitting me just as she leaned slightly on the counter. "It's nice," she said, "not to have to talk over everyone else all the time." Her smile softened as she set the mug down. "Sometimes it's nice to just talk." We found ourselves lingering near the counter, exchanging small stories about nothing and everything. Her voice was soothing, melodic in a way that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if the rest of the house, the world outside, had faded. She spoke of books she loved, travel she had taken long ago, little regrets she carried lightly. I listened, caught between fascination and an odd, quiet admiration for how comfortable she seemed in her own skin. And then it happened, the moment that would linger in my memory long after. As she laughed at a joke I made, she reached out instinctively to brush a strand of hair from my forehead. Her fingers were warm, gentle, and lingered longer than a mere gesture of courtesy. The contact was fleeting, but it left me aware of every nerve ending, every small, sudden pulse of heat in my chest. I caught myself staring at her hand as it retreated, almost wishing it had stayed, and I felt a tiny, involuntary longing I wasn't ready to name. We both noticed it, the small spark between us, and neither spoke of it aloud. Instead, the silence stretched comfortably, a shared acknowledgement of an unspoken tension. Her eyes found mine again, softer this time, and she smiled, not teasing or flirtatious, but quietly inviting. My heart raced, but my voice remained steady, my body aware of hers, every slight movement amplified by the intimacy of the moment. By the time my friend re-emerged from the other room, it was as though an invisible thread had woven itself between us. I felt seen, noticed, understood, and somehow, more awake than I had been all day. As she excused herself to tidy a few things in the kitchen, I caught the scent of her lingering in the air, and I realized this ordinary evening had become extraordinary in a way I couldn't yet explain. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. And in that quiet, shared space, I knew this was only the beginning of a connection that would quietly, irresistibly pull us towards something neither of us fully understood yet. It was late. The house had grown quiet, every sound softened by the deep stillness of the night. My friend had disappeared into his room hours ago, leaving the two of us in the dim glow of the living room lamp. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became a strangely intimate soundtrack. She appeared from the hallway, holding a small tray of cookies, and smiled at me, soft, inviting, as if she were offering more than just the snacks. "I thought you might want something before you leave," she said. Her voice had that same calm warmth, but there was something new in her gaze, a trace of mischief, curiosity, maybe even vulnerability. I took a cookie, trying not to overthink the moment, but my hands shook slightly. She sat down on the couch first, patting the spot beside her. "Join me," she said lightly. And so I did, careful to keep a respectful distance, yet feeling the magnetic pull of her presence as I lowered myself beside her. The couch suddenly felt too small, too intimate, every brush of our shoulders sending a ripple of awareness through me. We talked for a while, lightly, about movies and music, sharing stories that had no weight but somehow felt heavy in the quiet intimacy of the night. I noticed how her eyes softened when she laughed, how her hands moved almost unconsciously, smoothing her sweater or tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Every small gesture seemed amplified in the stillness, every smile lingering just a little too long. And then she leaned slightly closer, her voice dropping to a whisper, almost as if the shadows themselves had demanded secrecy. "You're not just his friend tonight," she said. The words landed softly but with undeniable weight. I froze, my chest tightening, pulse quickening. I didn't know whether to be startled or captivated. Her gaze was steady, curious, holding mine as though daring me to understand what she meant without speaking it aloud. I could feel her breath brush against my cheek as she spoke, warm and intimate, and her hand briefly rested near mine on the couch. Not touching, not pressing, but close enough that I was acutely aware of the space between us, and the pull that seemed to hum invisibly in the air. My mind raced with questions, cautions, and desires I wasn't ready to name. Her smile was small, quiet, not teasing, not provocative, but it carried a reassurance that made my hesitation feel safe. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that mirrored my own uncertainty. She wasn't demanding, wasn't pushing, she was simply letting the truth of her feelings brush against the edges of our reality. For a long moment neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick with unspoken emotion, curiosity, attraction, and the quiet thrill of crossing a line that neither of us had acknowledged before. It wasn't bold, it wasn't reckless, it was intimate, subtle, charged with possibility. When she finally moved slightly away, as if to release the tension without breaking it entirely, I felt the lingering warmth of her presence. That whisper had changed everything. I was aware of every sound, every breath, every heartbeat, and I knew, with an almost painful certainty, that nothing about our dynamic would ever feel ordinary again. Something had shifted in that quiet, fleeting whisper, an invisible tether, pulling us closer, drawing us into a delicate, uncharted territory neither of us had dared explore before. And I knew this was only the beginning. The hours that followed her whispered words felt heavy with unspoken possibility. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her voice had lowered, the warmth of her breath brushing my cheek, the way her hand had lingered near mine. And yet, as compelling as it all was, I felt the weight of boundaries pressing against the edges of my desire. She was my friend's mother, confident and self-possessed, and I was just me, a younger man caught in a quiet storm I wasn't entirely ready to navigate. Later that evening, she returned to the living room, her eyes catching mine with a mix of amusement and understanding, as if she had already guessed at my inner conflict. "You've been quiet," she observed softly, settling herself on the couch with effortless grace. There was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity, a gentle probe into a space I wasn't sure I wanted to admit existed. I hesitated, glancing at her, then away, then back. I don't know what to say," I admitted honestly, my voice low. My chest felt tight, as though I were holding something fragile and terrifying all at once. She leaned forward slightly, hands resting on her knees, and offered a small, patient smile. "You don't have to say anything. Sometimes, just being here is enough." Her words felt like a balm and a challenge at the same time, inviting me to sit with my own feelings without rushing toward them. We fell into a quiet rhythm, talking about lighter things, books we loved, music we remembered from our youth, little regrets we carried quietly, but beneath it all ran a subtle current of intimacy. Every time our shoulders brushed, I became acutely aware of the space we shared. Every glance felt charged with something neither of us had yet named. At one point, a silence stretched between us, heavy and intimate. I noticed the small, telling details, the warmth radiating from her sweater, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the faint scent of her perfume lingering like a memory. On impulse, and almost unconsciously, I reached out my hand and rested it lightly on hers, just at the edge, not pressing, not moving it, just letting our fingers hover near one another. Her eyes met mine, soft and steady, and for a moment, the world seemed to vanish. There was no rush, no expectation, only the quiet acknowledgement of our mutual hesitation. She didn't pull away, nor did she push me closer, she simply allowed the connection to exist in that fragile, tentative space. I realized, in that quiet stretch of time, that our attraction was as much about understanding and patience as it was about desire. It wasn't bold declarations or hurried advances that made my heart race. It was the unspoken respect, the careful acknowledgement of boundaries, the slow recognition of each other's presence as something meaningful, even sacred. By the time the night deepened into stillness, I understood that our connection was not about crossing lines. It was about holding the tension, savoring it, letting it breathe. Every glance, every small touch, every shared silence was a quiet affirmation of the trust and understanding slowly forming between us. And in that delicate hesitation, I felt the first true stirrings of something deep, something that neither of us could, or wanted, to name just yet. The days that followed were quiet, almost ordinary on the surface. But beneath that calm, the connection between us had begun to grow in subtle, undeniable ways. Every glance, every shared smile, every fleeting touch carried a weight I couldn't shake. Even in casual moments, passing each other in the hallway, sitting together on the couch during a movie, laughing over something trivial, the air between us seemed charged with an unspoken awareness. One evening, we found ourselves alone again, the house quiet, bathed in the soft glow of the living room lamp. She was sitting on the couch, curled slightly to one side, and gestured for me to sit next to her. I hesitated, aware of the delicate space between us, but then moved closer, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Yet, even that small step felt electric, the brush of her sleeve against mine, the faint warmth radiating from her presence, made it impossible to ignore the tension building between us. We talked, as we often did, about nothing in particular, and everything all at once. She shared stories of her travels from years past, small victories, and quiet regrets. Her voice carried a calm authority, tempered by a gentle vulnerability, and I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn by the sincerity of her words. Every so often, our hands would brush, accidental and fleeting, leaving a spark that lingered long after contact ended. At one point I noticed her watching me with a soft intensity that made my stomach flip. The way she looked, steady, thoughtful, slightly amused, made it hard to look away. I caught myself smiling, almost unconsciously, and she returned it, her eyes lingering on mine just a moment too long. There was a silent conversation happening there, full of questions neither of us dared to ask aloud. Then came the subtle closeness, the shoulder brushing, the way our knees sometimes touched when sitting side by side, the occasional hand hovering near mine. Not enough to cross any line, but enough to make the air feel warmer, the room feel smaller, and my heart feel unsteady in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She laughed at something I said, and as she leaned back, her hand brushed mine lightly, so light, so fleeting, that it could have been accidental. But I noticed. I always noticed. And when our fingers separated, I found myself missing the warmth instantly, aware that even the smallest gestures had become monumental. The tension between us was no longer just curiosity. It had evolved into something deeper, something tender, and almost sacred. I realized that the pull I felt toward her wasn't merely physical or fleeting. It was emotional, anchored in understanding, respect, and the quiet intimacy we had been building day by day. By the time I left that evening, I felt a bittersweet ache, a desire to linger, to speak, to reach out, tempered by the knowledge that we were still walking a delicate line. Yet beneath it all, there was hope, a quiet, steady understanding that this slow-burn connection was only growing stronger, building toward a moment we both knew, deep down, would eventually arrive. The evening air was cool, carrying a faint scent of jasmine from the garden outside, as I found myself once again sitting across from her in the living room. The rest of the house was quiet, every sound muted except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of a wall clock. It felt as though the world had paused just for us, leaving a space where words could finally mean more than they ever had before. She was there, calm and composed as always, but her eyes held something new, a glimmer of vulnerability, a quiet invitation that I had been waiting to recognize. For a long moment, we simply sat, letting the silence speak for us, each of us aware of the weight that had been building over days and nights of subtle glances, fleeting touches, and conversations that had slowly drawn us closer. "I need to be honest," I began, my voice low, uncertain. I think about you. More than I probably should." The words felt fragile as they left my lips, like delicate glass threatening to shatter if handled carelessly. I couldn't see her reaction at first, only that she was listening, her posture open, attentive, without judgment. Her lips curved into a small, soft smile. "I've felt the same," she admitted quietly, her voice carrying a warmth that made the room feel even more intimate. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure if it was real or if it was just fleeting." I swallowed, feeling a weight lift off my chest simply because she had acknowledged the same delicate truth I had been wrestling with. "It's real," I whispered, almost to myself. "And I don't want to rush it. I need you to know." She reached out, her hand hovering just above mine before finally resting gently against it. The warmth of her touch, firm yet soft, sent a quiet thrill through me. Her fingers curled slightly around mine, not demanding, not urgent, just reassuring. I felt the steady pulse of her hand against mine, the gentle pressure grounding me even as my heart raced. We stayed like that for a while, hands touching lightly, eyes locked in silent conversation. There were no bold gestures, no hurried confessions, only the slow, tender acknowledgement that our feelings were mutual, and that this delicate tension we had been nurturing could now exist in an open, honest way. Her smile deepened, a mixture of amusement and affection, and she leaned back slightly, letting her hand remain in mine. "I don't know what the future holds," she said softly, "but I want us to explore it, carefully, together." And in that quiet, unassuming moment, I realized the truth I had been searching for all along. Connection wasn't about bold declarations or impulsive actions, it was about understanding, respect, and the patient unfolding of something beautiful. The tension, the anticipation, the careful touches, they had led us here, to a shared understanding that neither of us had dared to hope for, yet both had been quietly craving. As we sat together, fingers intertwined, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known I was missing. This wasn't just attraction, it was trust, intimacy, and the beginning of something slow, deliberate, and meaningful. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this connection could last. The next morning, the world outside seemed softer, almost as if the sunlight knew something had changed. I walked into the kitchen, and there she was, moving gracefully around the space, her presence warm and familiar, yet carrying that quiet sense of intimacy we had discovered the night before. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh toast, comforting and ordinary, but the ordinary felt extraordinary now because we were finally unguarded with each other. She looked up and smiled, a slow, genuine curve of her lips that made my chest tighten pleasantly. "Good morning," she said, her voice light, teasing just enough to make me grin. There was no awkwardness, no tension left from the confessions of the previous night, only a steady, gentle understanding that we were navigating something delicate, together. I poured coffee, and she joined me at the small kitchen table. The quiet was easy between us, filled with the soft clatter of mugs and the occasional rustle of a newspaper. I noticed her hand brushing mine as she reached for the sugar, and instead of pulling away, I let our fingers linger near each other. The simple, tactile contact felt grounding, reassuring, a small, safe gesture of the bond that had formed. We talked about little things, plans for the day, a funny anecdote about my friend, the smell of rain on the window, but beneath the conversation ran the subtle thread of something deeper. Every glance, every small smile, every brush of the hand carried the weight of our shared understanding. It was a slow intimacy, one built on respect, trust, and the patience of two people discovering each other without haste. At one point, she leaned slightly forward, resting her chin on her hand, her eyes meeting mine with a softness that took my breath away. "I never expected this," she admitted, almost shyly, though her usual confidence remained intact. "I didn't know it could feel like this." I smiled, squeezing her hand lightly in response. "Neither did I," I said. "But I'm glad it does." The simplicity of the words carried all the meaning we needed, and she returned the smile, her fingers intertwining with mine in a way that felt like a quiet promise. Later, we settled on the couch, side by side, shoulders touching, comfortable in the presence of each other without the need for words. The sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the room, highlighting the subtle gestures, the brush of her hair against my shoulder, the gentle squeeze of our hands, the soft laughter that filled the quiet spaces. In that moment, I realized that our connection wasn't just about attraction, it was about understanding, patience, and the quiet building of trust. The tension that had once existed, the hesitation, the uncertainty, had transformed into something steady and warm. As I looked at her, the woman who had whispered words that changed everything, I felt a sense of contentment I hadn't known I was missing. This was not a fleeting thrill. It was a beginning, slow and deliberate, but filled with promise. And in the quiet of that morning, surrounded by soft sunlight and lingering warmth, I knew that we had found something rare, a connection that was real, tender, and ours to explore, together.